and I'm the Interim Director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome to this month's Conversations on Europe, which is part of our Year of Challenges Facing Europe. Today's topic is climate change, perspectives and initiatives from France and Italy. You will have the opportunity to ask questions. Feel free to post a question at any time during the discussion. We recommend that you use the Q&A rather than the chat. We will try to answer as many of your questions as we can. Today's conversation is presented by the European Studies Center, which is part of the University Center of International Studies at Pitt. It is co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. Our co-sponsors are the Georgia Tech Center for European and Transatlantic Studies, the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, the European Union Center at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Florida, the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. To learn more about our upcoming conversations on Europe, as well as other programming, please visit our website, which we will put in the chat. Here you can also find recordings of past conversations and additional materials. I'd like to thank Ingrid Gomez O'Toole for her help with today's event. This conversation on Europe was organized by Professor Giuseppina Mecchia of the Department of French and Italian at the University of Pittsburgh. I would now like to turn the program over to Professor Mecchia, who will introduce the panelists and moderate the discussion. Giuseppina.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Everything okay? Okay, great. So first of all, I want to thank the European Studies Center for giving us this opportunity and for the wonderful assistance they've provided technically to make this possible. So without further ado, I have a couple of introductory remarks. And as I told Joe, and then I hope that seamlessly the introductory remarks are going to conduce to the introduction of the panelists. So bear with me, I will fall back on my pause, hopefully. It's obvious now that there is a great visibility of the issue of climate change internationally and increasingly so on all sorts of media platforms. It's visible, and denial becomes less and less possible because of the visibility of the issue itself. The summer of 2022, of course, was the hottest one on record, and we have had also since the beginning of the war in Ukraine all sort of international environmental crises, both geopolitical and more strictly climate related. France and Italy, on the global scale, have been really at the forefront of the climate emergencies that we have dealt with. I just want to talk about a couple of peculiarities that make the issue of environmental management in France and Italy particularly urgent. And one really will be familiar to all of my audience, which is that these are both countries with, for instance, a very large visibility in terms of agricultural products, and they are very big exporters of prized and pricey agricultural products. Everybody in my audience will know how dairy products, cheese, yogurt, etc., are a big export for France. And both countries, of course, have built their reputations on their production, for instance, of wine. And besides the quantity produced, it's clear that the success of these agricultural products depends on their certified origin, right? You can only sell a bottle of wine for $250,000 if it comes from a certain region of France, right? So increasingly, we have been asking ourselves, what happens if that production is no longer possible? What are you going to do, right? Both in terms of cultural image, even more so for people like us who are in the humanities, we wonder about the cultural impact even more than the economic impact. Parmesan cheese, you can no longer have cows, in Italy, right? And so, and for France, there is this other little thing, which is not that small, which is it is a net exporter of energy because of the high production of energy in its nuclear plants. And I will not go into the discussion of whether or up to what extent nuclear energy could or should be considered green energy, because it's really above my pay grade to go into that kind of controversy. But I just want to say that this last summer, there has been a great concern because there was such an excessive heat that it was becoming very hard to cool the reactors down to a safe temperature for the continuation of their activities, so much so that in August, for instance, nuclear plants had to reduce productions. They had to reduce activity, right? So that it's really, I think that these two case studies anecdotally reported here
Oops, I think we have a problem with Giuseppina.
Yeah, she's
at least on my side. On yours too?
Yes.
Okay, I think our connection is
Yes,
has,
hopefully she'll
lapsed.
be. Josephina will be back in a minute. Well, she's gone.
Should we give her some more time? Oh, maybe she's coming back.
Okay.
Hi.
All right.
I'm sorry you froze. Josephina, can you hear us now?
Yes, now I can see you. Are you still connected?
Yeah, you disappeared for just 1 minute. We didn't hear the 2-3 last sentences, but
yeah, I saw that something must have happened. So I'll be concise. Another thing that I wanted to say with respect to energy and nuclear is just because it's an excellent example of how geopolitics, right, also have a role to play in environmental choices. France has long committed to a reduction in its dependency on nuclear energy and in increased investments on alternative energies like aeolian, solar, and even hydrogen generated energies. But now they have backtracked since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and actually they're now speeding up their building new reactors. All of this just to say that these countries have a visible and extremely urgent investment in environmental issues. And now, of course, being who we are, which are the three of us are humanities professor, you might wonder, well, why do you have literature and media scholars on this panel, right? And I would say that this comes from my conviction, which I know is shared by my fellow panelists, that climate change, environmental issues, and geopolitical issues cannot be left in the hands of politicians or okay, here I am again. Here I am again. And this is why we cannot leave it in the hands of technocrats, right? Technology will fail you. You have to be ready. And I want to say that in Europe, there are a few scholars which for several decades have contributed to the discussion of why it's necessary to have people in undisciplined fields or different disciplines, right, to have a role in environmental discussions. Today, I will only mention two names, which I think have been relevant to the work of my panelists.
The suspense is unbearable. Who's relevant to our work? Giuseppina, tell us.
What's happening?
No, we lost you again. You said two names. You were about to uncover two names that were relevant for us.
Okay, the two names. If you can hear me now, I think it's the technocrats. It's Félix Guattari, who proposed the necessity of an ecosophy, right, of a way of dealing with these issues theoretically, and Bruno Latour, who spoke of the necessity already in the early 2000s.
Sorry.
Yes, Bruno Latour in front. Okay.
We lost you.
Yeah, Bruno Latour. Actually, it's interesting because Félix Guattari with the three ecologies from the late 80s was very important in the ecological movement. And Bruno Latour also, although he came to it a bit later on, was one of the first ones in a journal called Écologie et Politique to really articulate a new model for thinking, the articulation between both of them. So I think we lost Giuseppina for
Even
good
maybe
now.
Jean Baudrillard. What do you think? Don't you think that Jean Baudrillard could be put into this group of people who
Interesting. I like him very much. I'm not sure about seeing him as crucial for the ecological part, but Giuseppina, we keep losing you. We keep losing you. So we're trying to blabber when you're gone.
You guys. So the necessity of including the earth as political actor, finding a way to give to the earth as non-speaking political actor a role in our discussions. So Félix Guattari and Bruno Latour. These people, I think the introduction of these two names brings me finally to the introduction to my guests. And I will introduce first Dr. Daniela Fargione, who's Associate Professor of American Studies.
Daniela, oh, here she's back again.
I could not hear the rest.
She's Associate Professor, now I see you guys again, Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Turin. But right now, most importantly, she's our exchange Fulbright scholar in the Department of French and Italian. And as she has been increasingly involved with the fields of environmental studies, environmental humanities, and eco-criticism, she's now teaching a class entitled Italy and the Environmental Crisis, where she looks at the work of writers that have been dealing with climate issues in Italy, climate-related issues in Italy, in modern and contemporary Italy. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Dr. Fargione.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Giuseppina. Thank you to everybody for this very generous presentation, but especially for this very pleasant invitation. And I want to thank the European Studies Center and with Professor Joe Olsen and Professor Paul Lewicki. And thanks to the Department of French and Italian for having me. And thanks to the Fulbright Commission that gave me the opportunity to be here and to teach about my country and about so many important concerns that I want to share with you today. Not only 20 minutes away from the home of one of my favorite pioneers in the environmental studies, which is, of course, Rachel Carson, but nothing else than in a cathedral, the Cathedral of Learning. So this is a very special moment for me. And I really want to thank you for giving me this great opportunity. Now, as my colleagues know, in Italy, I am a professor of American literature. And here, when I'm here in the United States, I am a professor of Italian literature and culture. That means that this continuous idea of going back and forth through the ocean really gives me the opportunity also to understand how many different similar problems are dealt differently in the two different sides of the ocean. I would like to share some of my ideas with you, and I have a PowerPoint presentation, and bear with me, and I hope, okay. No, I'm sorry. This is not the first image that I wanted. I want to be here. Okay. I want to start telling you that finally, as Giuseppina, Professor Mecchia said before, it is very visible. Now, climate change cannot be denied anymore. And in fact, I want to start telling you that the year 2022 in Italy was considered annus horribilis. Annus horribilis because, of course, so many different disasters really took place in one year, so much that I want to invite you to watch one experiment that took place at the end of 2022. Il Fatto Quotidiano, which is a daily newspaper, the daily fact is the literal translation, decided to put together all the different images that many journalists covered for the most important events that took place in Italy. And I do not have time, of course, to show it to you right now, but I want you, if you have time later, to go and check. This is a 3-minute short video that gives you all the images of the major events. And what is particularly interesting here is that most journalists really had the choice to very freely to choose whatever they thought was the most significant event for each of the 12 months. Now, out of these many news that were collected, there was just one, a single one that was about soccer and the soccer team of Milan winning the championship that didn't have anything to do with death. So we know now that climate change and death are definitely the two most important news that we need to consider. So we have images that start circulating. And as Professor Mecchia said, one of the major problems is visibility. Climate change is an invisible phenomenon. We cannot see it. while it is happening. We can only see it in its explosive way when it is too late actually to do anything for it. In Italy, we also collect, and we have collected recently, figures together with images. Legambiente, which is the most important and oldest association, environmental association in Italy, every year publishes what is called an Osservatorio della Città Clima. Through the study and the survey, they realized that there was in 2022 an increase of 55% of extreme weather events, especially in the northern areas, with the only exception of Sicily, the island that was particularly hit by climate change this year. And they realized that there were more than 300 events. And I just want to show you the three most important ones. In La Marmolada, with the glacier collapse that created an avalanche and 11 people were killed. So that what we call La Regina delle Dolomiti, the Queen of Dolomites, we know now that will possibly disappear in the next 30 years. The second important event that we want to remember now is the flood in the Marche region that was hit by water bombs. And of course, even here, we have 13 killed people. And Ischia, one of the most wonderful places in Italy, Casamicciola, here another terrible flood that killed another 12 people. What does it mean? That we're starting counting deaths because of climate change, even in Italy. And that we're started talking about il clima che cambia l'Italia. So more than talking about these events, I want to give you some useful, I hope, information on how to get some of these, events and some of the most important reflections, because il clima che cambia l'Italia, the climate that changes Italy, that is changing Italy, is also the title of the first book by Roberto Mezzalama, who is a scholar who, in fact, is working in my same town in Torino. Roberto Mezzalama, in the introduction of this wonderful book that was published by Einaudi, which is in fact the most important publishing house in Torino and one of the leading publishing houses in Italy, writes something extremely interesting to me, because he said that less than a century ago, Italy was a country of farmers. And then in 1 century, Italy really changed completely its physiognomy. All these different farmers living and working in a very different way, according to the region where they were. I want to remind you that Italy has 20 different regions, and they are so different from each other. There were different common denominators, though. The first one is that, of course, all the farmers, all the shepherds were strictly connected to the land, belonging to the land and to the rhythms of the natural world. The second is that they really represented with their work the culture of those places. And that culture, which is a great, immense patrimony, was passed orally, mainly orally, from one generation to another. And that is a series of knowledge that, of course, were collected through a very spatial acquired technique that was the reading of the sign of Il Bel Paese, the reading of the signs of the land. Because this is the very first important element that I want to keep in mind while talking about Il Bel Paese, talking about my country, and talking about this body that unfortunately is crumbling. That as any other body, this body also brings signs. And that while we're reading signs, we're also reading stories. Or as Serenella Juvino and Serpil Opperman. Serenella Juvino is professor, my former colleague at the University of Turin. Now she has moved here to the United States. And one of the first scholars, together with Serpil Opperman, to create a new branch of eco-criticism that is called material eco-criticism, that is really talking about the fact that each stories is nothing else than the concoction of so many different signs, and that the body of Italy is bringing all these signs. So also these farmers and shepherds were skilled in reading those signs that storied matter. And there is one proverb in particular that I want to repeat here, because most of these stories involved last century the weather and saints. They were, in fact, particularly important to understand what they were supposed to do. They, in fact, could not rely on scientific information or on weather forecasts or on insurance policies, but they could rely on the land. One interesting proverb that I want to repeat here. A Santa Caterina, chiudi le vacche nella cascina. A St. Catherine's Day, November the 24th, lock the cows in the stable. Now, if you go to any hills in the northern part of Italy, in November 24th, you will see that the cows are still there. Because the assumption of most farmers last century was that the climate would never change. The climate could be the guide to their everyday's activities, not anymore. So what is Italy's role in Europe? Just to give you other figures and other ideas. In 2021, Italy, I want to remember, was co-chair of COP26 in Glasgow and also had the presidency of G20. October 2021, Italy hosted the pre-COP and the Youth for Climate meetings in Milan, paving the way to Glasgow summit. And our prime minister at that time, Mario Draghi, continuously reiterated the support to the Green Deal. He, in fact, committed Italy to achieve a 55% reduction in carbon emission by 2030. We're safe. We have all these good intentions, right? And yet, if we look at some other charts, well, maybe we're not so safe. Maybe there is something that we need to reconsider. The perception of Italians, for instance, is not that safe, because according to a research, a European research with many other countries, Italy does not believe that climate change is among the major concerns of our country and in our time. In fact, it is located here in this blue part, light blue part, where the spread of infectious diseases is probably the most important, the most nation answered by country. In 2022, Italy shows a growing concern about climate change. So finally, we know that at COP27 that took place in Sharm el-Sheikh, Italy could definitely come with all the commitments signed in Glasgow, and in particular, 3 commitments. 1, the decrease of the use of fossil fuel. 2, this is a financial huge project, a very important project, to engage in the E3F, export finance for the future, in order to reorient the flux of capital towards projects that involve climate change and climate, and the investments directed to the renewable energy products. Here, again, we're safe, even in 2022. And yet, those are the intentions. The gap between the intentions and action is enormous. In fact, another interesting chart here gives us the opportunity to understand that Italy is 5th in Europe, the 5th country, in being among the most dependable countries on fossil fuel. And that probably we're going to be very slow in getting rid of them. Ecomafia is the last element that we need to bring into this conversation, because Legambiente generally concludes every year its survey considering these 4 interesting parameters to have a general idea what is happening in Italy. In blue, as you can see, we have track of the different crimes that have to do with mafia or eco-mafia and the environment in Italy. Of course, the first thing that comes up to our mind is Naples or Caserta, or the area that is called the Terra dei Fuochi and waste. The second parameter is the number of people or eco-mafiosi that have been reported to the police. But then, this is quite horrific, annus horribilis. We have in red the sequestration of goods and estates from eco-mafiosi. And here, the number of eco-mafiosi that have been arrested. No comment. Now, what do we need then? What does Italy need? The president of Legambiente, Stefano Cefani, for the third time this year, underlines 5 important issues that we really need to keep in mind. The first, more resources for a national adaptation plan. Italy is the only country in Italy that doesn't have one. Second, the administration and bureaucratic simplification to implement renewable energy. Third, more regional independence, because regions, as we said, are so different from one another that climate change means different things and proposes different problems. Prevention and education. Here we are a little bit better, I have to say, in comparison to other Mediterranean countries, because Italy has really invested in education very recently, of course, but is trying to catch up. Of course, there's no comparison with the countries in the north, in the northern part of Europe. Last but not the least, national laws. And these laws, especially against the use and soil consumption. But what do we need? We need what is happening in Italy, because if the answers cannot come from the government, if action doesn't come from the government, we have an action that started very slowly and very invisibly, but that now is getting more and more visible, which is a very new generation of environmentalists. These are mostly women, and this is a good news to me. They are angry, they are very passionate, they are young, they are very enthusiastic, they are educated, they are informed because they use technology in a very good way. And they use technology not only to get information, but to create something that we lost track of. They started creating, again, a community. So one of the most interesting phenomena that are happening in Italy among young people, many of these are my students, and I really am so happy when they come and try to involve me in some of their initiatives and events, is to create a community in order to share the same concerns, the same fears even, but also to share la piazza, meaning they go back. Scendere in piazza means to go back and rethink of l'agora, which is a very old concept, but it is coming back in Italy among young people, to go there and to have a sense of belonging and of sharing the same concerns. Ambientalismo senza lotta al capitalismo e giardinaggio. Environmentalism without a real fight against capitalism is nothing but gardening. Literatures can help us, because we need more money, more investment, but especially we need more stories. We need more activists also through the pen. These important stories that I want to tell you about very briefly are stories that are generally introduced in a very large category that is called eco-fiction or climate change narratives, that in Italy develops very slowly. Italy comes very late in comparison to so many different countries. And as Professor Giuseppina Mecchia said earlier, there is a whole generation of older writers in Italy who started to really talk, especially after the great influence of Rachel Carson's discoveries and writings, Italo Calvino, of course, in the 50s and 60s, Anna Maria Ortese, Gianni Celati. But now I want just to mention 3 or 4 of these important new writers. And I want to start with poetry. Chandra Livia Candiani, published by, again, Einaudi. Marco Armiero, who is from Naples and who is one of the most important historians, who wrote a book that was very awarded everywhere in the world, a book that was written in English, The Weistocene, and then later, only later published into Italian and published by Einaudi, L'era degli scarti. Laura Pugno, who in 2017 wrote Sirene. Unfortunately, she's never been translated into English, and I do hope that somebody translates this book, because The Mermaids is nothing else than the most important representation of the multi-species coexistence, which is part of this huge problem and conundrum of climate change. Bruno Arpaia, who is the first one in Italy who in 2018 published a cli-fi fiction, a cli-fi novel. Why do we need these stories? Why do we need more stories? For many different reasons. The first one, to decenter man, to decenter the human. So when we're reading Mermaids by Laura Pugno, we understand that the concept of otherness needs to be reconfigured, that the concept of monster, of the alien, needs to be reconfigured, definitely. We need to dismantle this false human exceptionalism that has made us very arrogant in order to talk again instead about emotions, about empathy. We need to translate together through emotions the scientific data that we need in order to create new stories and narrate new stories, but that sometimes are not really so passionate. And we need to go back and talk about one ingredient that we cannot forget, which is ethics, because reading without action is not useful at all. And the arts can give us another hope. The arts. And I want to show you, as my last slide, one panel of an exhibition that we have created at the University of Turin. This is a very important project that's been running for 4 years now. When I say we researchers and scholars of the University of Turin 4 years ago realized that one element was missing, which is precision in language. Because in Italy, we mix and match many concepts, sometimes not in a prolific way. Sometimes we even introduce words in English, changing the meaning of the word. This is called manipulation. This is called greenwashing. And this is, of course, against this manipulation that the University of Turin decided to create a guide, a manual called Lessico e Nuvole, Lexicon and Clouds, Le parole del cambiamento climatico, the words of climate change, that you can download at the link that I have presented here. Because we want to be very precise. And we also understood that there is only another important element that can give us success in this process, which is interdisciplinarity. We cannot believe that the humanities do not have a place in this huge and complex phenomenon. So the arts are particularly interesting and influential in Italy right now. They are giving us the possibility to imagine new worlds, because if we want a new world, as I write here, we need to imagine it first. Here you have a panel of an exhibition, because our guide has been transformed into an itinerant exhibition that we are, showing everywhere through Italy. And here we have a very important artist that particularly suggests to look at Lorenzo Queen, the son of a much more famous queen here in America. And Venice is definitely one of the most critical places that we need to protect. And I'm going to conclude my presentation only with one sentence in Italian that says: "Sono I folli visionari a fare le grandi rivoluzioni." It is the greatest revolution. The greatest revolutions are made by mad visionaries. So I do hope to be as mad as this climate change will ask me to be. So thank you so much for your attention and your patience.
Thank you so much, Daniela. I'm sorry I lost my connection. Now it seems to be everything to be really all right. Thank you so much. I'll ask the audience to hold the questions for the end of the session. And I'm now going to introduce our second speaker, who's Dr. Yves Citton, who's professor of literature and media studies at the University of Paris 8. He was here at Pitt for several years. I had the great fortune of calling him my colleague. In 2018, I will not go into detail. I just want to say the few things that are relevant, I think, to this particular context. In 2018, he founded a graduate program in France called Artec. And this program, I think, derives from Yves' original vision based on the vital interconnection existing in the human relationship to both self-expression and in the arts, in media outlets, and technical and scientific projects. So Artec, you understand there are these two words, art and tech, art and technology, which are vital to the mission of the program. Among the initiatives that Artec has been supporting is the creation of a web-based project that's called the Terraforma Corp project, which is a web-based collaborative AI platform, artificial intelligence platform, which is managed by an international equipe. This platform, I mean, Yves will explain it more better to you, but this platform recognizes the necessity of involving more than human or slightly different than human intelligences in our dealing with the climate crisis. So it's based on the blockchain technology. So it's a specific way of managing data which are interconnected, and then they sort of after there is one, there are other databases that interconnect to that. And today there is much anxiety in academic circles because it seems that our students will never need to write a paper again, because they will ask the artificial intelligence tool of choice, write me a good paper about the environmental crisis. However, there are more progressive ways, we hope, to deal with artificial intelligence. Yves also recognizes, Dr. Citton also recognizes that there is, besides the issue of finding a technical answer to this kind of questions, There is a ludic and performative aspect in participating to this kind of project, which is also a way to create community, actually, like Daniela said at the end of her intervention, and to put together people who might feel otherwise crushed on despair by the immensity of this planet, of this truly planetary challenge. And I'll leave the floor to Dr. Citton.
Thank you very much, Giuseppina. It's always a pleasure to interact with you and to be somehow back at Pitt, not in the cathedral, but I'm just proud to be back in the Pitt team and in West European Union studies and all these wonderful things. So I will try to keep it below 20 minutes or at least 25 minutes so that we have 20 minutes. So we have some time for discussion. I will do my presentation in two parts. First, a very general framing statement on what I see as our situation in terms of climate change from France. And then I'm going to focus more on what you introduced, Giuseppina, which is this project or this madness called Terraforma Corp. So first, I'm here in Paris, but I don't pretend to speak for France. I don't know what France thinks about climate change. I just happen to be in France. I happen to be Swiss also, so I don't totally identify with France, but I want to propose some sort of a SF, a speculative, not fiction, but speculative feeling, how I feel being in France in 2023. And what my feeling is about what's happening and what might be happening in the near future. And I will summarize this in 4 points, just to frame the situation. First, climate change issues have gained what I would call telegeny, just like talk about photogeny, I think photogeny or telegeny. It's becoming trendy, it's becoming hot to put climate change issues in the mode of catastrophic weather events on the top of today's 8 o'clock news. Until 2018, and both of you, Giuseppina and Daniela, you presented 2022 as being the crucial year, annus horribilis, for Italy. In France, I would go a little way back and I would say something happened in the summer of 2018. And from that moment on, instead of having a program on climate change at 11 o'clock at night on Arte channel, every night at 8 o'clock, you have some talking heads showing some form of catastrophe, drought, overheating, etc., and explicitly stating that it's due to climate change, to the point of it's becoming sort of a Pavlovian reaction. Whenever something goes wrong with the weather, it is climate change. And I'm happy that people do this connection that wasn't done for a long time. And yet it tells us something also that's both positive and both very problematic, I think, which is that climate change may very well be the tree that hides the forest. We think so much about climate change and issues of energy and carbon dioxide, etc., that we totally neglect biodiversity. I mean, a lot of other issues that are just as bad as climate change that becoming obfuscated by this. So something happened, I think, in France in 2018. And one of the things that happened is a surge in what is called in France collapsology. Collapse, sort of a discourse on collapse, sort of scientific or pseudo-scientific prediction on when our thermo-industrial system is going to collapse. And then people say 2024, 2030, etc. And an Italian friend of mine actually called Jacopo Rasmi and I wrote a book called Génération Collapsonaute, Collapsonaut Generations, because he was 30 years old at the time, I was more or less 60-year-old at the time, and the dialogue between us, between two generations on facing this horizon of collapse, we thought was interesting. Now, it's interesting, maybe since we're doing climate change from France and Italy, that him being Italian was going back across the Alps and talking about collapsology to his friend, or just watching the news, and it would be something totally exotic and out of another world in 2018 or 19. Whereas when he was coming back to France, it was in Le Monde, it was on French TV channels, it was the prime minister. I mean, there was this sort of trend of talking about collapse in France in 2018, 19, and 20. Whereas in Italy, he published a book on this, but nobody paid attention. And so I don't know if it changed now, but that was quite a strict difference between the two. Second point, yes, it's becoming telegenic. Yes, it is on our mind. I think on the broadest masses of the population, it is on our mind. We don't bother to deny it, or we can't deny it. And yet what we are in now is a tragic infrastructural incapacity of our governing bodies to operate the necessary changes of our infrastructure, or of the infrastructure that just nourishes us in terms of food, in terms of energy, in terms of information, etc., etc. So yes, in a way, it's great news that now we're all obsessed with climate change. It would be better if we were just as obsessed with biodiversity, and we're not, but it's already better than it used to be maybe 5 years ago. And yet it doesn't help much between the governing bodies are infrastructurally incapable of doing the necessary changes. Now, what are these necessary changes? Usually people talk about transition, energy transition, or economic transition, something. I think transition is dead. There's just no hope. Whenever somebody talks about transition, I think he's out of it. It's not going to be a transition. Now, Daniela, you talked about revolution at the end of your talk, about generations and new generations being revolutionary. I am not too optimistic about revolution, not because it's not going to happen. I don't know. I'm not seeing the future, but I think we need something else than a revolution. I think the way we think about revolution, just seizing power, is just not going to be enough. Maybe it's necessary, but it would be much too easy if that was the case. It's something that we've never faced in history. Call it a transmutation, and we don't know what a transmutation is, but it's something like that needs to happen, and it is not happening because of the infrastructural incapacity of our governing bodies to go in that direction at the proper speed. Now, third point, because of this incapacity and because of this feeling of doom and gloom and emergency at the same time, I think we have to face the risk of an increasing risk of political victories of what I would call reactionary utopias. Reactionary utopias being a utopian thinking of another possible world, but another possible world who would be located in the past. Let's call it, to be very brief and direct, white supremacy. In Europe, it is a dream of Europe for European, without all these colored people coming to us and taking our bread and our jobs, etc., etc. In the US, it's clearly stated as white supremacy. In Europe, less so, but I think basically it's the same idea. We were okay in the roaring 30s and after World War II. Then something messed up, and call it neoliberalism, call it migration, call it whatever you want. And we want to go back to the little paradise that it was, which wasn't at all a paradise, which has a lot of problems, which is at the root of what we're facing now. But these reactionary utopias, call it neo-fascism, call it white supremacy, call it, well, different ways to call it. I think it is a real threat. And I'm very worried about this, and we can talk about what's happening now in Italy. And I don't know what's happening now in Italy, but I'll be interested in knowing more about it. Now, fourth point, I want to mention a writer, a literary writer from Congo called Sonny Labu Tanzi. And Sonny Labu Tanzi, who died, unfortunately, very young in 1995, before his death in the early 1990s, which I remind you is when the Berlin Wall fell down and where we were thinking of a new world order and a new order of peace, even if it was Pax Americana. In several writings, Sonny Labutanzi talked about an alternative. Either we continue as we're going now, and it will be what he called La guerre des mondes, a war of the worlds. And when he talked about a war of the worlds in 1990, he wasn't thinking about a clash of civilization between Islam and whatever. He was talking about a war between the well-offs, he calls them in French, les nantis, the rich or the well-offs, and the impoverished, les appauvris. In continuation with colonization, with colonial, settler colonialism, this is what he was anticipating is just a war of the worlds. And what he states as an alternative to that was planetary solidarity. Planetary solidarity at a planetary scale, which is very different from what we at the same time started calling globalization. And this situation, the fact that when I read now Sonny Labutanzi's writing of the 1990s, just like when I read what Félix Guattari was writing about ecology, Deleuze and Guattari, what they were writing in the 90s, you could just take it now, sign it now, and publish it, and we haven't moved that much forward in terms of conceptualization, in terms of analysis, in terms of what is to be done. The difference is that these issues, instead of being at 11 o'clock at night on Arte, they are, the consequences of these issues are at the 8 o'clock news, but our capacity to make sense of it, I feel, has been really stagnant over these years. Now, this is not so much hopeful. What I'm saying now, it's not so much hopeful, and I don't have much hope. Not only that, but I'm suspicious of discourses of hope. And so I'm aligned with collapsology. I'm aligned also with certain aspect, not all of them, but certain aspect of Afro-pessimism in seeing in the very notion of hope, as Obama would ride on when he was elected, something that is actually very dangerous and that we should be very wary of it. So yet, I don't think we should give up on trying to do something. I don't know what to do, but I can tell you what happened in France last year on a very tiny scale of about 15 people who were involved in what Giuseppina Mecchia referred to earlier, which is one of the programs of this Artec business, which is sort of a university, a consortium of university. And we gathered 15 students from very different origins in terms of nation and continent, who had the specificity of being both artists, or half of them were artists with a little experience in the art world, and half of them coming from the social sciences, the humanities, etc. And I'm just going to narrate in about 5 to less than 10 minutes what we did, what happened to us, what we didn't understand in what happened to us, and how that maybe, I don't know if it's a source of hope, but it's just a very narrow pathway maybe to something different. So we started by reading a very problematic text, which nevertheless I advise you to read, and I translated into French, even if I disagree with half of it, by Benjamin Bratton, and the text is called The Terraforming 2019. I will go very briefly in summarizing the premise of the terraforming, which was the premise of what these 15 people did together. Usually when science fiction talks about terraforming, we think of terraforming planet Mars, or we from Earth try to settle, try to colonize, try to make habitable a foreign planet, say Mars. And this was terraforming. Now, Bratton turns this around and says, what we have been doing with our planet Earth in a way is to de-terraform it. It was habitable, and the proof, we're here. So it's habitable for us and for monkeys and for tigers and for ants and for all these things. We are managing now to make it almost as inhabitable soon as planet Mars is. So we have to terraform planet Earth which is we have to reroute this artificialization of planet Earth. We cannot go back to nature. This is just not an option. With 50% of the world population living in big cities, you can't just say, now guys, you just go back to the field. It's not going to happen. So we have to reorient the terraformation of planet Earth in another direction. So it's a matter of terraformation and it's a matter of planetarity. And I'm just going to briefly contrast a number of words which we tend to use as equivalent, and I'd like to distinguish. First, when we talk about a world or our world is a cultural entity. It's a certain perspective with certain values on maybe the planet, but it's our world. And we know from another thing that world collapse, civilization and world and culture disappear and collapse. So maybe this is the thermo-industrial world, not the planet, not mankind that's collapsing, not life on Earth, but just one world which happens to be ours. Then when we talk about the globe, we are seeing the same thing through, I think, the economy, through logistics, through planetary scale system of exchange, trade, and mostly financing. And this is globalization. Then there's another layer on top or separate, which we know as geopolitics. It is about the Earth, but it's about politics, about international law, about COP, about all these things, which try through international agreements, so you have the nations who get in agreement or not, to do something political. Then you have another layer, which would be Gaia. We mentioned Latour earlier, Lynn Margulis, etc., etc. And Gaia is to represent this thing, that this blue planet as sort of an entity that has its own balances, imbalances, dynamics, etc., etc. And top layer for me is what is now called planetarity. And planetarity is more radical than all of these things before, from our point of view, from the point of view of climate change, because it is looking at the Earth as a planet to be terraformed. Just like we look at planet Mars as a planet, now we have to look at planet Earth as a planet. And the key question is not just habitability of the planet, but cohabitability, because we cannot be humans without non-human beings, and we cannot be French without Italians, or we cannot be Europeans without cultures from other nations fertilizing us. So cohabitability is the question that you ask if you think in terms of planetarity, and maintaining, or maybe rather curating, the cohabitability of the Earth is the central question. Now, this needs a new form of organization. Call it organization, call it incorporation if you have Gaia at the horizon, if you think in terms of planetary. And what we did with these 15 people is that we tried to figure out in a fiction, in a common, call it hope, call it dream, call it observation, call it fiction, what would be a form of corporation, not Exxon, not a financial commercial corporation, but a body, a form of organization body that the Earth would be. And we called it a Terraforma Corp. And we're wondering what type of organization could we devise, or could we imagine, or could we narrate to understand what would be a corporation or a corp that would be at the scale of planetarity and helping address these issues of cohabitability at the scale of planetarity. So this model of organization that we fictioned through Terraforma Corp had to have three main characteristics. It had to be decentralized. It cannot have headquarters in New York, or for that matter in Beijing. So decentralized. It had to be autonomous, not depend on that government, on this. It had to have its own sort of self-developing, self-organizing nature, autonomous, and it had to be scalable at a planetary scale. So that was our fiction. And in the last 2 months of our project, this started in October and we finished end of September 2022. So we started writing something, we write reports, we write a thing, and then we tried to do the history of what we were doing. And all of a sudden we saw popping up from our observations all kind of decentralized, autonomous organization, potentially scalable at a planetary scale. A lot of them claimed to be DAOs, decentralized autonomous organization, which is something that started on Ethereum, the blockchain, in 2016, which immediately after raising a lot of money just collapsed. It was hacked and it collapsed. But a lot of DAOs, decentralized autonomous organization, sort of keep popping up and pretend. And for me, I'm not at all an advocate of these institutions saying this is our future, this is this is going to save us. Not at all. I think it's just as bad as it could be fantastic. But a myriad of these DAOs are popping up right and left. Not only that, but a myriad of ways of communicating across borders, across species, ways of myriads of NGOs, again, international or very local, myriads of resistance, take it into their main agenda, issues of cohabitability. And what was originally, and I'm going to stop on this, what was originally a fiction, a speculative fiction, the more we looked around, the more we thought, oh my God, we didn't invent it. We thought we were inventing a Terraformer Corp, but the Terraformer Corp is already here. Just it's decentralized, it's autonomous, it is at very different scales, and we haven't noticed that it is here, that it's taking shape. We have to do something, not to pretend to be the owner or the author of it, but just how can we reorient our actions in, again, co-organization with these myriads of organizations that are already here. And that's why we did this report. And that's why I'm sure stop here, because otherwise we won't have any time for the discussion. And hopefully with Giuseppina and Pittsburgh, we're going to continue, do a second annual report of this Terraformer Corp next year, we hope, if the world is still has not collapsed yet.
So thank you so much for your presentations. And right now, I'm sure that people will have a lot of questions, and I hope you don't feel overwhelmed by the diversity of the issues. And I hope that you guys can start putting questions either by raising your hand, actually, as Joe has encouraged us to do. You can use the question and answer command on your Zoom app, and I just opened it on my screen, so hopefully you guys can ask us questions, either for Dr. Fargione or for Dr. Citton.
If there are no questions, maybe in the meantime, I can launch one to Daniela. Is that possible?
Yeah.
I was wondering, Daniela, how do you evaluate the new power that was elected last year in terms of, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of things to say, but on these narrow, broad, and at the same time, specific issues of climate change? How can you, I'm sure you're ready now to speak for 2 hours, but how could you summarize something like that?
2 hours. I think we need 2 lifetimes. And I have to say, first of all, that we're not very far away. Our positions are really similar. And I really want to thank you because you anticipated all the issues that I'm going to tackle in my next lecture that very kindly these people asked me to give in March. So, and in fact, my next lecture is the title is climate fiction. I can't remember, but it is the climate crisis or something like that, and multi-species cohabitation, because I think that is the central issue. The idea of decentering the human means that we really need to start thinking differently. So when I'm talking about a revolution, I'm not talking, of course, about, turning tables in a very romantic and sentimentalized way. That is not the revolution I'm thinking of. The revolution is, first of all, a revolution of the mind, which doesn't mean today I'm going to start doing recycling because this is what my municipality is asking me, or I'm going to, turn the tap off when I'm brushing my teeth. Let's stop thinking that. That is not, of course, a revolution at all. But the revolution is, first of all, the revolution of education. And I don't want to feel, especially, I don't want to feel guilty for somebody else's responsibilities. Meaning we're all involved in this game. Unfortunately, we're going exactly to the same place. And when we're talking about nature, and that's the only thing that maybe I could not really feel sympathetic with in your discourse when you say that we cannot go back to nature, but we are nature. We are already there. We cannot go back to nature because we are already there. Our body is an environment, and we completely forget about that. We completely forget that in our body, we have 10%, I underline this, 10% of human genome, only 10%. All the rest is lichens, minerals, and viruses, and bacteria, and anything else, and vegetal world. So 10%. And because of that 10%, we think that we are so powerful. And here we come to the other element that you put into your wonderful project that now I have to know more. I'm sorry, I have to come to Paris. You know that, right? That is the whole saving philosophy. Because we are so arrogant, we humans, that we believe that we can save the planet, save the world, save the polar bear, of course, which is another interesting answer that I wanted to give you, because when you say that we are so photogenic, and now you know that every single campaign in Italy has a polar bear, because of course there is this megafauna that is, there is a wonderful project actually at the University of Florence on the loss of biodiversity. And they have worked a lot on the aesthetic part and the aesthetic influence, how we perceive climate change through very aesthetic meme, right? And the polar bear is one of those, because of course we can recognize a certain figure that is so similar to what we are. And because, of course, we are attracted, in fact, by what is more similar to our body and more similar to our figures. So I could go on forever, but to go back just to your question, which was, what do you think of this new government? I'm going to talk to you when we meet. In private. Nothing. There is nothing to be said. I have to say that it is very discouraging. It is very discouraging to have a new minister of the environment who cannot really understand what the real needs are. And there are certain people who keep asking over and over and over again that those 5 points of Legambiente, those 5 requests keep coming up. We need laws, we need implementation. We do not need a lot of money for nothing, for creating campaigns that have no action and no reaction to anything. We need more. But that's what the only thing that gives me, I cannot say hope, but some relief, because I'm not so, I would say, optimistic, I have to say, is the fact that the young generation now, my students now, are much more informed, and they are angry. They are angry. They want to have answers. They cannot just stop there, sitting there, waiting for another government that is telling us a very nice story. C'era una volta il re. We don't need that anymore. We need something different. Sorry, I could go on forever, but we need to have another conversation.
Okay, so we have two questions in the question and answer. Do you guys, Yves, can you see? The first question is for you. Can you see it?
In the chat? No, I don't have them in the chat.
Not in the chat. There is another command that is called question and answer, Q&A.
Sorry, I'm deficient. I'm challenged on.
Okay, so I'll read the question. What do you think is the role of great power competition between Beijing and Moscow, for instance, for influence in the so-called developing world? And what do you think that this competition will play in providing a political and material resources for promoting planetarity? What do you think, Yves?
Well, thanks for it's a great question, and I don't at all have the means to address it properly and to say anything very meaningful, except that at least I think we should admit that we are seeing all these issues from a very narrow Northern European, not Northern European, but European perspective. And that looking at these issues from Beijing or Shanghai, I think is just not understandable for us. I just cannot imagine what these things look like from Shanghai. And part of the economic power is clearly concentrating there. We're clearly at the end of a certain world domination from white folks coming from Europe or from the US. Yet at the end of a dominance like this, it's the moment where wars tend to increase. And I think the fact that it's white folks waging war with each other in Russia, and that it's NATO who's so eager to participate in it for good reasons, but also maybe for more difficult reasons, I think it says a lot about just white land, as my friend from Cameroon says. He calls just this white land. Well, white land is waging war against itself. If I had hope, I would think that this is the old world collapsing and that maybe something else is going to come around. But when you see Chinese nationalism being so eager to get Taiwan back into the nation and the nation state, they have just been, I don't know, I think this is, again, it's very difficult for me to get hope on that. So I think I cannot measure the decentration, we're talking about centration, the decentration that has already been happening from Western Europe, the US to China. What I can understand from China, and I don't pretend to understand what's happening, is not so encouraging. And yet, I would put a question mark rather than just thorough condemnation or looking at it from above and saying that everything is terrible. So I don't know, but that's the question. Actually, I wanted to say it in my talk. That's one of the dead angles, I think, blind spots of a lot of our talk about all these climate change and issues and political issues and so forth.
Thank you very much, Yves. And there is a second question, which I think we can pose to the both of you. We were talking, Yves, you were talking about one cannot go back to nature, and then, but then Daniela said, but we are nature. And I think that this question can be, I think, addressed briefly to the both of you. Can making nature or outside exposure a more integral part of our daily lives? If you make outside exposure, and could that influence humans' impact on climate change? So what do you guys think? I don't know who wants to take the question first.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for Daniela, because what you said earlier, that we cannot go back to nature because we are nature, that's the best continuation of the sentence. And thank you. That's fantastic. So I'm letting you answer this one.
Daniela, you can take that.
I just did not understand. I don't think I understand the question very well.
So can increasing our exposure to nature, can making nature or outside exposure a more integral part of our daily lives, could that influence humans' impact on climate change?
Our perception, maybe our perception, because that's the problem. We don't know that we are nature. It's exactly the same discourse that we had before. The fact that we keep separating nature from culture, that we think that nature is something green that is beyond that window, really doesn't take us anywhere. And the first thing is education, instruction, and instruction and education comes from stories, reading stories, being exposed to stories. And when I'm talking about literature, I don't talk only about fiction or about the stories that have been published, but stories come from nature. If we read our body, if we read trees, if we read rivers and hills, there is an immense patrimony of stories there. It is what I meant before when I said that this matter is storied, comes storied, because it has so many signs that we give and that we can read. So these stories need to be read. And it's to be read collectively before being read in a very independent way, because we need to share these stories. And there is another word that I would like to introduce, because in this idea of planetarity, while Yves was talking before, he said, point number 3, when you were talking about white supremacy, the idea of creating this utopia, which is, of course, not only going back to the Arcadia, to the perfection in nature, but that means, of course, to create a new fascism, a white supremacy everywhere in the world, a new fascism, just to give you some hint of where we're going in Italy. But there is another important problem that I can see, which I called presentism. The idea of erasing the past, the idea of canceling memories, of canceling everything. And that is exactly what is happening, because when we are talking about the loss of biodiversity, we're not talking only about the loss of one species. We're talking about the loss of an entire ecosystem. Inside an entire ecosystem, there is also the patrimony of our traditions, of our languages. When one little country, when one island in the ocean is completely erased by these oceans coming, the rising waters, we're not only eliminating people, they're eliminating memories, stories, languages, connections. We're eliminating so many different ecosystems there. And we do not understand that we're still thinking in individual terms. That's the major problem. When we start thinking as a planet, here, that's the meaning of planetarity to me also. When we're start thinking in terms of community, of sharing, of feeling empathy, with somebody else's sufferings. And when I'm talking about individuals, I'm not talking about humans only. An individual is also a non-human entity. It might be the branch of a tree or a cockroach and not just a polar bear, It may mean any human organism that is part of my ecosystem. So only at that time, maybe we can start thinking of a revolution together.
And for the question, I really like the question talking about exposure. I think the notion of exposure to me is very interesting, and it's very ambivalent, because on the one hand, we build houses, we build culture to sort of protect us, to protect each other and to protect us from dangers outside. And yet, one of the things we're living now, and Roberto Esposito in Italy and a lot of people have philosophized about this, is this overprotection, dreaming of immunity. immunity being totally against protected in a sort of walled community, gated community, against foreigners, against diseases, against anything that would be alien. And so I think exposure and immunity and the risk of exposure and the necessity to be exposed to some form of outside, to some form of alien, because we can only be ourselves in relation with forms of alien, including of alienations. I think this is one of the crucial issues that's very difficult for us to deal with, because we're stuck in identity, as you said, sort of individual identity, human identity, white identity, protecting itself from the rest. And this is a very basic problem, to accept some form of exposure as, yes, a risk, but as a condition for cohabitability. So thank you for the question again. It was, obviously we can do justice to it, but it was so rich, yeah.
And also, if I may, not only the aliens that are being recognized in our everyday life, but Anna Tsing, who is a fantastic anthropologist, who is working so much on the concept of multi-species cohabitation. She has done this incredible research on mushrooms that you all know, possibly. She's talking about ghosts. We need the alien and the ghost and the monsters are all, and zombies maybe also, are all these creatures that are not just fictional creatures anymore. They are very real. And every single time we go and take a walk in a wood, we just need to start thinking and rethinking of the concept of death, because my death is the beginning of somebody else's life. And we need to start reconsidering our position on this planet, in fact. So that's why I think that the concept of planetarity is so important in this discourse on climate change. So thank you for the wonderful questions.
Thank you very much to the panelists and to the public. Josephine, I don't know, Joe, I don't know that we have time to really take another question and answer it.
Yeah, I think it's about time to.
I think it's about time to wind it down. I would love for you, I know that both our panelists, Dr. Yves Citton and Dr. Daniela Fargione, would love to interact with you once this session has expired.
Vous finissez à quelle heure?
Maintenant.
Ouais, comme ça, parce que je bloque même les portes, sinon.
Okay, I'm being kicked out of here, so we have to stop because I'm going to spend the night at the.
So thank you so much for your participation, and both our panelists will love to answer your questions via email if you want to get in touch with them. If you want to know more, you can also get in touch with me, and I will try to direct your question or your inquiry to the right person. And I really want to
Thank you, Giuseppina.
Thank you,
Thank
ciao.
you, Daniela.
Thank you.
Grazie
Bye.
Ciao, arrivederci.
Ciao, grazie per questo invito. Thank you.